Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Seattle's Civil War Legacy. Tonight, I should say, we are very proud to welcome Codie Eash for a live stream. And we're going to talk Union veterans and memorials and monuments, things of that nature, as we come up on Memorial Day here this weekend. So I'll start off. We'll let Codie introduce himself, tell us who he is, and why we should listen to what he has to say.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in and watching. My name is Codie Eash. I am based in South Central Pennsylvania. My day job is at the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center in Gettysburg, located in the heart of the First Days battlefield. Grew up in York County, Pennsylvania, just about 30 miles east of Gettysburg. Graduate of Shippensburg University of Pennsylvania in 2014. I have a degree in communication journalism and had a history minor. And in addition to my day job at Seminary Ridge Museum, where I've been for about 8 years since we opened in 2013, I operate the Facebook page Codie Eash, Writer and Historian, which focuses predominantly on the Civil War era. And then I'm also a founding contributor to Pennsylvania in the Civil War, co-host on Battles and Banter podcast, which is a military history podcast covering kind of all eras and all conflicts, and just recently started contributing book reviews to Civil War Monitor magazine. Have some other things in the works now. Frequent lecturer at Park Service sites, historical societies, roundtables. You might have seen me around Facebook Live events over the past year or so, but keep myself busy, all things history, particularly Civil War era. Really enjoy subjects of memory, veterans, those sort of topics. So really excited to be a part of the discussion tonight.
Good. Well, I am glad to have you. And for anybody who reads any of Codie's writing or his posts, I think the best part of your work is your mining of really great primary source material in quotes and things. And that's what's really going to help us shine tonight, because what I'd like to talk about and what we'd like to get an understanding of is, first of all, that we have, I should say, for a non-Seattle crowd, that we had about, right here in Seattle and King County, we had all told about 3,000 Union Civil War veterans that lived here. I think at the max peak, it was about 2,500. So there's a lot of Civil War culture here in the city, and it's Civil War culture that's reminiscent of what is in other places, and particularly fascinating and curious to people is why we have Civil War monuments in Washington State, but we have them everywhere. So I'm going to let Codie kind of explain here now. Just introduce the fact that we're going to come back around to them being the fact that we have Civil War monuments and veterans culture here in Seattle, how that came about on the whole nationally, starting with the post-war period, battlefield monumentation, civic monumentations, that sort of thing. So that's the context of what we want to have Codie talk about. And he's gonna tell us lots about what they said in their words, I think, which is going to give it some particular weight as we go into Memorial Day, that we are hearing what they told us, not what the books told us, but why these things are the way they are here and elsewhere. So with that, Codie, if you want to start off, I can pull up your PowerPoint anytime for images. Sure. If you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead and just pull it up now. I think
okay.
We'll kind of go back to many of these subjects throughout the discussion, but just to kind of lay base work here, I'll use Gettysburg as an example, and I think that it's a really kind of fitting example because as we all know who study the Civil War, it becomes, whether deserved or not, and that's another debate, the most central, most significant place to veterans, to the public at large, and really kind of continues to this day as that. If you're going to visit one Civil War battlefield, typically it's Gettysburg. And it is, of course, it occurs about halfway through the war in July 1863, and pretty much immediately becomes that central place to which people visit and write about and think about when they're deciphering and considering why it is that the Civil War had such a grip on the nation and where its central places are. And when we talk about Union veterans as a whole, that is a concept to which they attach themselves very quickly. What you can see on your screen there is just kind of an overall graphic of, kind of charting that period of monumentation. And Civil War battlefield monuments come about a bit earlier than town monuments throughout the entire country. And here we can see an example of several firsts. So we'll talk about the monuments first and then talk about what these meant to the veterans and the other ways they memorialized. The war, of course, ends in April and May 1865. And pretty much immediately, as you can see at the top left, the image there is Major General Oliver Otis Howard, who had been the 11th Corps commander in the Union Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, eventually commands an army under William Sherman by the end of the conflict, returns to Gettysburg for the dedication of the cornerstone of Soldiers National Monument, which, for those who have been to Gettysburg, sits in the National Cemetery, one of the largest monuments, tallest monuments on the battlefield. But it will have its cornerstone dedicated literally the year that the war ended, in July 1865, just a couple of months after the conclusion of the conflict, 2 years after the battle on which field that battle was fought. It'll take a couple of years for that monument to be completed. At the top right, 1869, George Gordon Meade, who had been former commander of the Army of the Potomac, will return to Gettysburg and deliver the keynote oration at the dedication of the full monument. But in the middle of the top there, you can see the first Minnesota urn, which is dedicated in 1867. And that is the first full monument that's dedicated on the Gettysburg battlefield. And that monument in particular offers us a nice little case study into the thinking that Union veterans had and that the people on the home front had, particularly politicians and elected officials, when it came to remembering the Civil War. And basically, long story short, is this. In 1866 and 67, the veterans of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry wished to dedicate a monument to their service on the Gettysburg battlefield. And they will petition to their home state legislature, and that legislature will petition to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, which had been established literally within weeks of the battle and would oversee the field until the 1890s, when the War Department will overtake it, eventually becoming what we know today as Gettysburg National Military Park. And initially, the Memorial Association declines the monument, but they will ultimately, of course, accept it. It still stands there today, but it's relatively reluctantly. Basically, they say, wouldn't it look strange if only one regiment places a monument on this battlefield, when surely the large national monument will be enough, and that no other regimental organizations, no other states, we suspect, will follow suit. And today that's comical to look back on, because not only will there be many more monuments at Gettysburg, but there will literally be one monument to every federal regiment that served at Gettysburg, many Confederate monuments, which is a whole other story in its own right, War Department markers, plaques, all of these items that start with the origin of Union veterans wanting to memorialize what they did at this, what it started as a United States Veterans Memorial Park in the case of Gettysburg. And then that will just grow through the years. Bottom left, you can see the Strong Vincent Memorial, famous brigade commander in the Union 5th Corps. The spot where he is mortally wounded on Little Round Top is the first monument dedicated outside of the National Cemetery, followed at the bottom right by the first regimental monument outside of the National Cemetery, the 2nd Massachusetts in near Culp's Hill and Spangler's Meadow, and then the Gouverneur Warren statue, dedicated in 1888 as the first statue to an individual on the battlefield. And these are all just firsts, but there are 1,300 monuments, memorials, markers of one form or another on the Gettysburg battlefield, and most of these are dedicated, in terms of monuments themselves, are dedicated by Union veterans. And they would hold these very large festivities. They would have parades through the town. They would have, of course, speeches and poetry and music, gatherings at churches and encampments. And we so often think almost exclusively, when it comes to Gettysburg reunions, of the blue-gray reunions, these joint reunions in 1913 and 1938, for instance. But by and large, the vast majority of these reunions will be by Union veterans themselves, speaking amongst themselves, and they tell us some really powerful things along the way, as we'll see throughout the evening. By 1888, the 25th anniversary of the battle, this is a small sampling of what Gettysburg would have looked like. This is a famous bird's eye map that is published for the 25th anniversary of the battle, and it's surrounded by these little images, these insets of memorials that are on the battlefield by that time, and that has continued to grow to this day. Gettysburg becomes this massive memorial landscape. I forget what else I have here. Let's see. An interesting case as we start to get toward the 1890s is that these monuments are going to start sprouting up all throughout the North. Union veterans, now that they have dedicated a lot of monuments at places like Gettysburg, places like Antietam, we'll talk about some of the similarities and differences between those battlefields and how they memorialize them. But town monuments will start going up. And here is one particularly interesting one. A caveat here is, for context, typically monuments did not deal with causes and consequences of the war, with the exception of mentioning union or reunion, something of that sort. But speeches almost always, and we'll see a few examples, they almost always mention slavery and emancipation as a central cause for which Union veterans recognized they had fought and won. And it's a fair point, as many people would say today, that most of these soldiers did not enlist in 1861, 62, 63 to end slavery. But by the time we get to the post-war monumentation era, most of these men recognize that regardless of what they once thought when they enlisted, they see that this is a genuine outcome of what they did on battlefields. And this example here of this monument is to Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania veterans. This is in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Those familiar with Yingling beer, this is where it is brewed. This is in the territory of, for those who follow winning history, Jake Wynn, one of my fellow contributors to Penn Civil War. This is Northeast Pennsylvania, where he covers. But this monument in particular is really fascinating. It's kind of a general Civil War monument that you see on many town squares, but Union veterans told us something very specific about what they fought for. This is dedicated in 1897. And you can see in the center just kind of the general monument itself, one view of it. And if you look at the bottom of the left and right images, you can see two battles mentioned there. Fort Sumter, of course, the start of the war, Gettysburg on the right, bloodiest battle, seen as the turning point of the Eastern theater of the war. There's a third side that I don't have pictured there that mentions Appomattox as kind of that symbolic conclusion of the war. But the fourth side of the monument, a battle that these soldiers also wanted to be remembered, says, you can read it there, it says emancipation. And so here we have a very interesting case where Union veterans wanted people to realize that when they visited this monument, when they thought about what these Union veterans fought and died for on battlefields, that ending slavery in America was a central tenet of that. This is a rare example to see it carved into granite or marble form there. But so often this would have been something that was featured pretty heavily in veterans' speeches. And with regard to speeches, and we'll talk about some of these specifically, but we can see that another way that, in addition to monuments, veterans memorialized what they did was through publications of these compilations of speeches that are delivered. Here's just a few examples from Gettysburg, from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maine. But at Gettysburg, at Antietam, at Chattanooga, at many major battlefields of the war, where there are larger quantities of monuments in particular, all of these monument dedication speeches were typically compiled by states and then sold in relatively small quantities. You can find them reprinted oftentimes today. You can also find most of these, almost all of them, these four examples certainly, digitized online. And they give us just tens of thousands of words, hundreds of speeches that these veterans not only spoke on battlefields, but considered worthy enough for posterity to eventually publish. So I just want to kind of give a couple of examples of what these speeches would have been, and the things that veterans really wanted us to think about and consider, because in the end, these monuments are just as much for us as they were for veterans themselves. The reason that they're constructing them and making them out of good materials, which becomes a major facet on battlefields in particular, they want these to be of what the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association called chaste materials, materials that would stand the test of time. But time and time again, veterans talk about their children and their children's children. Very famous repetitive line that we see in so many of these addresses. They want us to visit these sites. They want us to read these words. And my favorite example of a monument dedication speech, and I'll read a bit from it here, comes from a veteran named J.C. Truesdale of the 105th Pennsylvania Infantry. He was the chaplain of the regiment, and that's a common theme at monument dedications as well, is that it's typically veterans who had religious training. We oftentimes see reverends, chaplains, and I would suppose that's because they are the men most used to pontificating as is, writing sermons and delivering public addresses. But this is what Chaplain Truesdale said at Gettysburg. And this is in 1889, which is right smack in the middle of that era of monumentation. And this was at an occasion called Pennsylvania Day, which was actually 2 days, September 11th and 12th, 1889. But as was so often the case at Gettysburg, at Antietam, at other battlefields, those two in particular, veterans would arrive in large groups by state. So you'd have New Jersey Day, you'd have New York Day, Massachusetts Day, Maine Day, Pennsylvania Day, you name it. These veterans are showing up and they are dedicating monuments by the state. Hold on 1 second. Sorry. My laptop is about to die. It's not plugged in. I'm sorry. Plugging it in here. Thought I had taken care of that already. All right. So this is what Chaplain J.C. Truesdale says at Gettysburg in 1889, and it's indicative of many Civil War veterans, Union veterans. He said, "Have the loyal people of the land forgotten their soldiers? Let Decoration Day answer," and that is the tradition we today call Memorial Day. He said, "Let the millions our government is paying out in pensions answer. Let the soldiers' homes in all these northern states answer. The people of this land will never forget the men who fought their battles and saved the nation's life. They are dead, and yet they live. In the homes and communities from which they went out to die, and in all our land today they live. And they live, too, in the grand results of the war. The nation saved, the Union preserved, not one state gone out, not one star blotted from the old flag, slavery destroyed, other nations inspired with a respect for us and a confidence in our future such as they never had before. The liberation of the spirit of progress, the Union not only preserved, but stronger than ever. The nation no longer half slave and half free, but free, truly free, and untrammeled, to take its place and accomplish its mission among the nations. These are some of the results. In blood and treasure, in suffering and tears, we paid a goodly price for these things, but are they not worth the price? This 4 years fratricidal war was a dreadful thing. But for this nation, there was something worse than this war. The dissolution of the Union was worse. Slavery was worse. And so when the gauge of battle was thrown down by those who determined to have a government with slavery for its cornerstone, we said, rather than these things, let us have war, dreadful war. War on 100 battlefields, war by land and by sea. We are sometimes charged with waving the bloody shirt when we talk about the war. Well, if stating the cause of the war, what it meant, what it was fought for, what it has accomplished, if that be waving the bloody shirt, then in the name of all the Union soldiers, living and dead, I say, let it wave. And I've always felt that that is a very indicative voicing of opinions by many Union veterans, that they are concerned with the ideas for which they fought and their comrades fell, that they are concerned with national shouts for reconciliation, but asking at what cost. They're willing to extend that hand and forgive, but never quite forget what they fought against. And I think that kind of sets a base work for understanding how Union veterans wanted to be remembered in the decades after the Civil War.
Sure. Well, that's a great segue to this, because one thing I wanted to mention was how, despite the distance, we see almost word for word the same things coming from the Union veterans here in Washington. It's a little, to me, it's different. It's a different dynamic slightly, because we're on the battlefield or in the towns of Pennsylvania or Maine or Michigan or whatever. There's a little bit more of a I guess, a community base. So if you're going to have this monument in Schuylkill County, it's going to be probably to the men who enlisted from there. The different dynamic is here in Washington, it's just a total grab bag of veterans. If you have 100 veterans here, they were in 100 different regiments. They served in 50 different campaigns and 75 different battles. So there's a little less cohesion, but yet what they said is nearly identical to what you just read. So, for example, the soldier I put up here, this is Addison Hasty. Oh, wrong one. Let's go. Let me skip ahead to this fellow, Patrick Carroll. He was in the 48th Pennsylvania. Actually, he was involved in digging the mine at the crater. They say he was one of the last 3 out of the tunnel when they lit the fuse. Interesting. He has a super, super interesting career. He was the GR leader here. His wife was a UDC leader, which is worthy of a book all of its own, the relationship between those two, I'm sure. But his words, comparing him to what you just read, this is Patrick Carroll, Lieutenant Patrick Carroll, in 1888 on Memorial Day here in Seattle. He says, "Has the war for the Union and freedom left us any legacy that needs to be buried in oblivion? If it has, then the names of our comrades in arms ought not to be remembered, and the memory of the men who died in defense of the cause of right should be blotted out. But if the cause of the Union for which men gave their lives was a just one, then our fellow comrades should not be forgotten, and their deeds, their valor, their patriotism should be inscribed on the heart of every loyal citizen and transmitted to future generations to teach them the intelligence and self-sacrifice necessary to maintain the Republic." Those are strong words, and those could have come right off a speech at any regimental monument on the Gettysburg battlefield or in any town across, that had, as a community, sacrificed. So to me, that's really fascinating that the prose that they use is exactly the same, that all these Union veterans, no matter where they were, here, there, even if they went to England and put up a monument in London, they would be saying the same thing. And the consistency is to me is remarkable, actually. But what I am curious on your thoughts is why the monumentation? You don't really see that to this level before. So is it just culturally with like Victorian America and their relation to death, and that they would build, because cemeteries of the same period have these ornate gravestones and obelisks, and they look like mini battlefield monuments, and we don't really see that before and after. So what was it about this generation that was so fixated on memory and memorialization and in that form of granite monuments and in these speeches? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is just the scale. When we think about the fact that 2 million soldiers will fight in defense of the United States, 1 million for the Confederacy. This is an event in which 3 million individuals actively participate as armed combatants, let alone the direct involvement of the average American at large across the landscape. This is an event that, probably with the exception of the Second World War, impacts everyday Americans more so than just about any period in United States history. And so I think that just that idea of having lived through the dramatic events that these folks collectively did, they see this as a matter of necessity, I guess we could say, to memorialize it in some lasting fashion. And I think that that's a mentality that has largely continued to this day. The fact that the Civil War remains, I would say, easily the single most written about military event in American history, specific battles that are more written about than just about almost anything in military history. It's a mentality that develops very early on at places like Gettysburg, but eventually spreads across the nation at large. I also think that the causes that are at stake are unlike just about anything else. Both sides in the course of the Civil War will, of course, feel as though they are fighting some remnant of the Second American Revolution, a term that is thrown around a lot. Both sides feel that they are representing the side that the colonists did in the American Revolution.
Sure.
And I think that Union veterans, having, by virtue of the fact that they win this war, they get bragging rights to that claim, and they really do see themselves as the heir of their fathers and grandfathers who had founded the United States. I think a really good example of this sort of thinking comes to us from Captain J.C. Johnson. He was a veteran of the 149th Pennsylvania, part of the famous Bucktail, one of the Bucktail regiments under Colonel Roy Stone. And in his monument dedication speech at Gettysburg, he makes kind of a gutsy claim that not many veterans did, but I have a feeling that many are thinking this without saying it. And he says that, in part, just kind of paraphrasing some of it, and then I'll directly quote him, but he says, we fought to perpetuate law and crystallize the truths declared by the fathers of the Republic. We may quickly pass away, centuries will roll by, but these granite monuments will endure, and the American youth will come to this monumented field to study its lessons. So basically, to this point, this isn't the controversial part, but he's saying, we are the heirs of the fathers of the Republic, and we're putting these monuments up to remember what we did. And then he says this: a nation cannot be great without also being good. And by as much as we are greater than our forefathers of a century ago, we are also better than them. The generation that freed the slaves is better than the generation that wrought to constitutional bonds to enslave the free. And so he is saying we have not only accomplished what the revolutionary generation could not, but we are better people for it. Now, I think the optimistic part of that we could say, there's a pompous aspect to that, but I think there's an optimistic piece that we could read between the lines, and he is essentially saying one could hope that every generation is better than the generation that preceded it, that we are better than the revolutionary generation, but that hopefully our children are better than us, and we're putting these monuments here so that they might look up to us as examples to improve upon the things that we have not accomplished by this war or by other means. Mm-hmm. And so I think that those are really kind of a couple of things at play. I would say that in the more kind of memorialization aspects, outside of remembering kind of the heroics of soldiers, but in that kind of remembering the dead sort of vein, traditions like Decoration Day today, Memorial Day, I think that once again, it's just the scale. In this case, the scale of mass death forces an entire generation to cope with that. And we see the creation of the national cemetery system come out of the American Civil War. Even things like pensions and the sheer number of prosthetic limbs that are created. I think all of that is a very sort of macabre but unifying aspect, and it only adds to that aura of remembering something that is just massive and so much bigger than anything that anybody had lived through up to that time.
And I wonder too, like, as for people, sort of our age, I guess, that our parents and grandparents, or the people that were in World War II and Vietnam and the Korean War or later, that those, and even World War I for that matter, that those conflicts were captured more, I guess we would phrase it now, in media. There was pictures, movies, a form of record that could be passed on, that other people could see it and not have to read it in a book, but it sort of communicated it through the culture. And without that, I wonder if that was the monumentation was kind of a form of that. You couldn't do a Ken Burns Civil War series.
Good point.
But the only way you could tell the story was to have, something that caught their attention, and then the words on the plaque, and then the speeches, and that was their tool for storytelling, in a way. Mm-hmm. I kind of see it that way. And so with some of the speeches, with the Seattle veterans on Memorial Day and that sort of thing, I often feel like they're reaching, I think, really hammer home that it's like we're trying to communicate to the children how important this is, how important loyalty, patriotism, responsibility, that it's, it's like to them, it's, of course, it's passing on their legacy, but it's their teaching tool as well, which it's only recently that I've really come to see them that way. And the more speeches I read, and like the speeches you read, that's where it's really set in, like, wow, these are devices of communication. not just memorial, not just to mourn them or, consider their heroism or their sacrifice, but actually to hear the message that they want us to hear, which I think is a fascinating aspect. And the fact that we have them here, and they said that, in Washington, they've literally in the dedications and stuff, they say like, this is why we're putting it here, to teach you guys what we did.
Mm-hmm. And I think that what you said there with regard to the physical text of the dedication speeches, they are maybe my favorite form. They don't tell us the most, but I think that in terms of their enjoying reading pieces of Civil War literature, they might be my favorite thing that veterans wrote. And I think that the main reason for that is not the flowery language or those sort of facets, but the fact that it's the only form of document that we have that, especially in the case of a battlefield monument, is prepared to be delivered at the site where the things that they are talking about happened. And so unlike a regimental history, which is, written in someone's office and published and disseminated for people to read elsewhere, these monument dedication speeches, before they are done the same with, before they are published, their physical purpose was to be read at the site where the men fell about whom their comrades are speaking. When they are referencing physical places on the battlefield, I think it kind of adds another dimension, the fact that they were reading those words at the very place that they're speaking about. And so in that way, it's very much a teaching tool. And we can utilize those when you go to a battlefield, when veterans are referencing a particular tree or a rock or another monument. As time goes on, they use additional monuments to recognize where they were on battlefields. So I think that in that regard, it is certainly a teaching tool as well.
Do you feel, because you've certainly read more of these dedication speeches than I have, do you feel like they, and I know each speech, there'll be a primary oration and then a secondary, and the one I'm most familiar with is from the 83rd New York, which, is close to your work. And there was a New York, I think a state senator or a federal senator that delivered the primary address at that. And I wondered, when you read them, the sense I got from him is he was sort of speaking to them, but he really wasn't speaking with a sense of longevity to the speech, and not just like on this site, but on this site. Plus, if you do happen to read this in 2021, I want you to get this out of it too. Do you get that sense with the battlefield specific dedications that their posterity is really a part of what they're saying in the speeches too?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I think it is really fascinating in that regard. There will be those lines that jump out that, it sounds, sort of cheesy, I guess you could say, but it really does. There are certain lines that pop off the page and you think like, wow, he could easily be talking to me today. Yeah. Particularly when they are issues that we're still debating today, or just in sense of place. Sometimes they will make that reference to some landmark, and you think like, oh, I can go see that landmark still today. That they are, of course, speaking to an audience, like you said, but there is that recognition. And I think that happens especially as time goes on. Those later monument dedications, when they know that their words are going to be published. For instance, Pennsylvania Day, I mentioned in 1889, part of the deal was that the state of Pennsylvania would pay for each regiment to have a monument. They dedicate 53 monuments in 2 days. But part of that deal is that they're going to eventually compile and publish all of the remarks. And sometimes you can see, like at the when I did research a couple years ago at the Gettysburg National Military Park Library, there was a copy of a speech. I forget which regiment it was, but it was a Pennsylvania unit, and it was not the same copy of the speech that appears in the published work. So there is some editing, there is some I guess you could say censorship.
Yeah.
There are some pieces that are changed. So
Huh.
that's something to consider as well, is that the words that the men actually stated on the battlefield may differ a little bit. And that could be for any number of reasons and motivations. But
Uh-huh.
there's a very clear intent in that regard to toy with the words so that it is for a future audience.
Have you noticed any difference between the battlefield dedication speeches versus the whether it's a big city memorial thing like in Pittsburgh, or like I said, the small on the village green, a little monument somewhere in New Hampshire? Do you think there's a different dynamic to those speeches? Are they saying something differently, or what's your take on that, if you have one, between
Sure. I think the
environment?
big picture themes are all still there.
Okay.
Union, emancipation, treason,
Mhm.
all of those key words, they're all used there, for and against, as it would be. But I think that those, and this makes a lot of sense when we think about it, that the town square monuments, there's certainly more of a local emphasis. They are focusing not necessarily upon how did a particular regiment fit into the broader scheme of a battle or the war, but rather this monument is for the people who serve from this community, and here's what this community gave to the larger war effort. And then in those instances, they'll name private so and so and captain so and so, specific people from the town, family members of theirs. That seems to be a much more common thread, is localizing the war, whereas on a battlefield, typically you're taking your regiment and you're applying it to the bigger picture. So there is kind of that reverse effect, I think, depending on where you are. There's also not as much of an emphasis upon the touchier issues in a town square monument. And I think that is really interesting, because you have a larger sect of the populace, hypothetically, who is physically present for the dedication of the monument. Probably more press are there. Whereas on the battlefield, when you have veterans talking amongst veterans and veterans' family members, that's when they'll rail against Confederate veterans. That's when they'll speak in favor of emancipation. That's when they'll make the sometimes, just in terms of the more macabre, gory stories. There aren't too many of those in monument dedication speeches, but every once in a while, those ones on the battlefield, they'll tell that more intimate, personal, bloody story. That sort of stuff you don't see on the town lawn.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting dynamic to some of the speeches here too, is that we lack the that aspect of it, of the people from the community who died on the battlefield, who gave their lives. That's always in their mind, and when they, it's the earliest, first Memorial Day observation here in Seattle was in 1879. We had our first GR post in 1878, following year, and they put up like a cenotaph basically on the university grounds, and they did, covered it with flowers, and it was, that one was specifically like, we're giving a tribute to those who gave their lives, because the guys that were here had just gotten here. None of them had passed away yet. There wasn't a thing. But then as it goes on, you start to see less about that, the sacrifice of people we're familiar with on the battlefield. It's more the comrades who gave their, gave up there's some quotes that say they gave up their life, but not like they took a bullet, but they gave up their occupation. They sacrificed. They went out onto the thing. They gave up their health. That's mentioned several times, that they sacrificed their well-being and everything. And it's different tones from the battlefield, I think, which is kind of interesting. It's what they use as the example for sacrifice changes with the distance and with the time. And so I imagine that the Town Square Monument in Pennsylvania is probably somewhere between the speech at the wheat field on the Gettysburg battlefield and the speech in the cemetery in Washington State. Sure. I think they probably have a little of both. So it's kind of interesting to me to see the progress, both chronologically, but just with distance and theme, and there's connections, but they evolve differently, which is, it's kind of neat. But there are some pretty fiery speeches. These guys,
they really are. Yep.
Oh man, when some of these Memorial Day and July 4th speeches, they didn't hold back, especially like you said, around other veterans. Oh man, there's some harsh stuff. Do you think because the civic monumentation era was a little bit later than the battlefield. And I don't know if the civic is the way to phrase it, but I'll just use that phrase
Sure.
for now. Do you think as it went onward and we see the emergence of Confederate monumentation, the pushback, that sort of battle for vindication, battle for whose cause was the more just, do you see that influencing the speeches and things over time as that became more present? Because the 1882 speech and 1902 speech are going to be different eras of their conflict with the Confederate monumentation.
Certainly. Yeah. And I think that an excellent example of this, I've returned to a few times, but it's just such a good blueprint, is the 1889 Pennsylvania Day. So all the Pennsylvania, not all, but most of the Pennsylvania monuments that are dedicated at Gettysburg. And 3 years earlier, in November 1886, on November 19th, no less, so the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, the first Confederate monument goes up at Gettysburg to the 1st Maryland Battalion, otherwise known as the 2nd Maryland Infantry. And it stays pretty quiet for about 3 years. There are a couple of op-eds there's one from a group of Vermont veterans that say that they want it to be taken down. But it's pretty mum for a while until all these Pennsylvania veterans come back. There are like 50,000 Pennsylvania veterans that show up over 2 days in 1889. And when they get home, particularly in Western Pennsylvania, it seems like they're especially fiery. We see a couple of things come out of it. Grand Army of the Republic posts, which GAR, for those unaware, most influential and largest veterans organization among Union veterans in the aftermath of the Civil War. At a bunch of GAR posts, there are these meeting minutes where you can see that they're talking about two things right after Pennsylvania Day. One, it was great to see our comrades. We really enjoyed getting back and dedicating our monument. It was great to get back to Gettysburg. And then number two, by the way, what's up with that Confederate monument? And immediately there is a national outcry. It starts locally in Pittsburgh, it spreads to Pennsylvania, and it becomes national, to the point that the Grand Army of the Republic in many chapters of the GAR will call for the monument to be taken down. And just reading a couple of headlines here: rebel monuments offensive, no rebel memorial, that monument, opposing the rebel monument, things along that line. Very commonplace for about 6 months or so, late 1889, early 1890. And eventually the monument stays, but it's vandalized. And there's a Union veteran who writes a piece in a magazine, I believe in New York, in the early 1890s. And he has reason to believe, he says, that it was a fellow veteran who vandalized it. Where we can see this kind of really working itself into speeches is that at Gettysburg, after the dedication of that monument, and others like it start to spread throughout the country, veterans take a pretty hostile tone to it. Just a couple brief examples. J. Richards Boyle of the 111th Pennsylvania, he talks about the results of this war, and he targets it specifically. It's almost as if he's talking to Confederate veterans. He says the results of this war mean the absolute civil equality of all men before the law. Slavery died in the Union trenches. The bondman became at once a freeman, a patriot soldier, and a legal citizen. The idea which animated the rebellious armies has been conquered. It has been exploded. It no longer exists. The whole scheme of a Southern Confederacy has collapsed and perished. There remains not even a lost cause. The Union was literally and unconditionally vindicated, and it therefore has the right to impose terms upon the vanquished. Even more direct to monumentation, Captain Thomas E. Merchant of the 84th Pennsylvania, he would say, in part, that he felt that the one-time Confederate soldiers are deserving to have their hands shaken by us, but the government, this reading from him now, shall have taken the life from every camp of sons of Confederate veterans and united daughters of the Confederacy, and the government's strong arm should have swept from the soil the first monument to rebellion, warning that the placing of the second would be known as treason. No monument to treason should have been permitted a place on this or any other field, and being here should be returned to the donors, not to be erected elsewhere. And then he goes on to say there can be no true call for a reunion of the blue and gray. Let all don the blue. So just a couple of examples of how this does work its way into that identity of Union veterans. And the subject of Confederate monumentation is, of course, a whole other one for another time. But it becomes, by the 25th or so anniversary of the war, an identifying factor. Union veterans start to question why it is that the men who they fought against, who represented all the ideals they fought against, why they are seeming to get a renewed stake and say in the political sphere across the United States. And veterans, Union veterans, seem to have this feeling that, there's a lot of dialogue that takes place around this time that, you all Confederate veterans, you all can have the Southern battlefields, you can have the places where you had victories, you can have Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, etc. Gettysburg and Antietam are for us. And then once Confederate monuments start showing up at those locations, there's this significant pushback against that. And then on a larger scale, you have, of course, the end of Reconstruction, the origins of Jim Crow, all of those sorts of things that are happening at a national level. And for Union veterans, that becomes a major point of contention.
Mm. Yeah, I see that in various degrees throughout the 30 plus years of speeches of the Seattle veterans too. It's remarkable stuff. The consistency among the veterans, no matter where they're at, or like you mentioned, we see it accelerate, of course, and they probably just get a little bit more fanatical about it as they're getting older and they're starting to die, and they get they're digging in even harder on it. But it's fascinating to me that the rhetoric and the language between here and everywhere else is it's almost identical in a lot of cases. So I want to come back here just a little bit, because we've talked about the monuments in Seattle a little bit, and I think people might just be curious to kind of see them. I don't know that many people outside of Seattle, of course, have ever witnessed or would know that they were here. Oops, wrong screen. Let's try this one so we can both see it. So this is just a cool photo, I thought. It's 1920. This is a parade of Union veterans. It's from the newspaper. It's digitized. It's a rough scan. This is right in front of the famous Pike Place Market in downtown Seattle. So you can go stand on this spot, and you can see the same sign in the background. So I just thought that was kind of a neat and relevant photo. But here's some of our monuments. They're a little underwhelming compared probably to your average Pennsylvania town monument. We have a lot of obelisks. I don't know why that seems to be the thing, but they all sort of look the same. This is a monument from 1909 here in Seattle. This one gets photographed on the page a lot. This is in our GR cemetery. Oh, that's a good question I wanted to ask you. So all our monuments, and I can click through them here as you answer this question. Our monuments in this area are all installed by either individual Grand Army posts or the Women's Relief Corps auxiliary that was based around that post. Sometimes, like this one was that we had 3 GR posts in Seattle, and the WRC for the 3 of them pooled together and bought this monument. This one went up in 1909. They initially mentioned wanting a monument in 1883. So I don't know why the veterans themselves couldn't get or wouldn't spend the money on it, but it took them almost 30 years to actually get the monument, which is kind of interesting. But they weren't put together by donations from the citizens of Seattle or a veterans association, or you said the Pennsylvania monuments were paid by Pennsylvania. So who generally installed those monuments there versus our GR?
Sure. So town squares, similar kind of thing. So a lot of ladies' organizations of one form or another, Grand Army of the Republic posts, by and large, that's your average town square monument. Okay. And cemetery monuments for that matter. Monuments on battlefields initially are, and this is, I would say, the case particularly for Gettysburg and Antietam, just because that's where I've mostly have studied. But by and large, the early monuments, looking at 1870s or so, placed by regimental monument or regimental associations, so veterans organizations themselves. Okay. When you go to a Gettysburg, for instance, though, or Antietam, you will notice that there are many monuments that have state seals upon them. And that's an automatic indicator that it was paid for by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the state of New York, whatever it might be. For instance, at Antietam, I think it's 1904, Pennsylvania pays for anybody who had not previously put up a monument there. And that money will go to units that fought, Ninth Corps regiments, for instance, good example, didn't fight at Gettysburg. So the money that would have gone to a unit to put up a monument at Gettysburg, they weren't there, so they're going to put up a monument at Antietam. In Gettysburg in 1889 is those 53 monuments that I mentioned earlier. Those are all paid for by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Now, as a caveat to that, you will notice that with some regiments, Pennsylvania, New York especially, there might be some other instances, a couple of main monuments that come to mind, but the regimental associations, the veterans themselves, have placed a monument, but then the state is willing to give them money. In the case of Pennsylvania, it's $1,500, which is today worth a little more than $40,000. So that would have been the amount of money given to every regimental organization from Pennsylvania, regardless of whether they had previously put a monument. And so what you typically see with those sorts of units is they'll do one of two things. Either build another monument as an advance marker or another position that they served on another day of the battle, or they'll fix or add to their monument. That doesn't happen too often. But there will be some instances where you'll see a photograph of a monument dedication in 1885, let's say, and then go to that monument today, and the monument looks different. And that's because at some point, probably in 1889, or depending on another state, another year, where the state gave them additional funds that they had not previously had. And then the agreement there is basically you'll put the seal of the state on the monument, and that's an indication that it was paid for by your home state. So it's a combination. It starts out as a lot of personal payment by veterans. I mentioned the first Minnesota urn is the first unit monument on the battlefield. That's paid for by the veterans from Minnesota, but they have two other monuments on the battlefield that are. I think at least one is paid for by the state. Examples like that are plenty.
Do you know? So, with in Pittsburgh, I haven't been. So, forgive me if I misstate this, but the Soldiers and Sailors Hall, that's what it's called. That was started by the colonel from the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry, right?
I'm not as familiar with the origin of it. Rich Condon would be a good Civil War Pittsburgh.
So I get the feeling that one's a little bit more of a privately funded thing, at least from just the financial side of it. Was the burden was probably borne by private citizens, not from tax or anything like that.
And typically, a lot of those town square sort of things, unless it's explicitly to a group of veterans or something like that, it's usually not a public endeavor.
Yeah, see, that was kind of interesting to me here, because we have these monuments again. I'll point this out. This is another Seattle monument. This is the tallest one. I like this one. So it was 1911, I believe. But being that this is a Women's Relief Corps monument. They got theirs in 1901. They were the first one in Seattle to get it. So they were like, if we're going to pay for all these, I guess we're going to get ours first. And then you guys can wait another 10 years to get the one across the street. Another Washington obelisk. And then this one here. This one's really cool. This is the closest to a battlefield monument. This one's, I think, 30 feet high. This is a little north of Seattle. But being that these were all we had some super, super wealthy incredibly successful businessmen here who were leading veterans, leading civic figures. And I was like, these guys could have all just bought a monument. It would have been nothing for this guy. We have one guy who's basically owned a large portion of the city, built a gigantic private hotel, this luxurious thing for his guests for this World's Fair thing we had in 1909. I'm like, he could have paid for this monument 20 years ago instead of waiting around. I wondered if there was like a feeling that these had to be done a certain way, that the GR had to come up with the funding. It had to be equal among all the members. Like one guy couldn't just step in and carry the load for all the other people. Like maybe in Pittsburgh, to build a gigantic hall like that, they couldn't collect $1 donations and put that thing up. Somebody somebody with a lot of money was going to have to say, look, I'll put up a lot of money to build this thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if there was a feeling against doing that because of the veterans community. It's just something I've been thinking about, and I was wondering if you had, maybe you could either tell me I'm totally wrong, or maybe that's familiar.
I don't have any direct insight, but the rationale sounds reasonable. Like that could have easily been what happened.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm curious to see if there's any difference here on the Seattle monuments. How do they refer to the Civil War? What term do they use? Do they use Civil War on it?
Oh man, you know what? Most of them don't say anything. I'll zoom in here. It says 61, 65.
Yep.
Let me go back to. I can zoom in and show you specifically. That's the Women's Relief Corps monument. Let's get back to this. This one also says 1861 to 1865, and then we have this one. It just says, "In memory of our heroes." Whatever, courtesy of the Women's Relief Corps, 1861 to 1865. The one that's in the Soldiers' Home Cemetery, same thing. It says, that one says, this is dedicated to our boys in blue, but it never says war, Civil War, anything other than heroes in the years. And I wonder if that's because there aren't battlefield dead. That may have some aspect to that.
Sure.
They're really saying these are just the old veterans. These are not. These are there's no battlefield casualties contained in anywhere in these places. So that may have changed the tone of what they put on the monuments. But
sure. Reason I ask is it's interesting that Union veterans in particular will hold very dearly onto that terminology of refer to it as the War of the Rebellion, making sure that it's not the war between the states, that it's not just the war for the Union, but they make sure that term rebellion is there to ensure that
do you see that term on monuments in Pennsylvania?
Sometimes, and do you mind if I share my screen again? I have an interesting example of one here. The ones that do use that term are usually early on. However, here's a case of one. This is in Westchester, so Chester County near Philadelphia. There you can see the full monument. It's at the courthouse on the left. But then on the right, this is dedicated in 1913. So this is 50 years after. And if you see, during the late War of the Rebellion for the preservation of the Union. And so they throw in both of those. And
interesting.
I have never gone back and looked to see the newspaper articles that corresponded with this one. But when I walked up to this for the first time a few years ago while visiting, I was really, really surprised first to see War of the Rebellion on there, because you don't see it terribly often, but sometimes you do. And then to see the date, to see that it was that's 50 years after the fact. So really kind of fascinating. You can really tell the mindset of veterans just based on the term that they use to describe the war.
Wow. Well, here, now that you were reading that, I looked up two more from the eastern side of the state, from Spokane. And we have one that just simply says, "To our honored dead," a tribute from the citizens of Whitman County to its, this one has to do with public schools. So our honored dead, and then another one that's in memory of our departed comrades. But they're heavy on the GAR thing. So I'll have the GR post, a little engraving of the GR badge, that sort of thing. So that seemed to be more the identity was what they were putting forward rather than. But it's interesting. I never thought about that war of the rebellion, that sort of thing. I never. I don't see it here. I wouldn't even consider that they would have done that in other places. That's interesting. I'll have to look through. Unfortunately, especially with the libraries closed this year, I haven't been able to see if I can find dedication speeches to any of the Seattle area monuments. They may be in some GR encampment annual that's buried in the University of Washington or something. But that kind of stings a little bit, because I'd really like to hear specific. I know who did the speech, but they're not in the newspapers, and so we're missing a little bit of that, unfortunately. But so yeah, that's pretty much all I got from the Seattle side, and it's neat. So it's my conclusion is that you think it's different, but it's not really. It's the same guys saying the same stuff in the same place at the same time, year to year. after the Maryland Monument in Gettysburg, you will see an uptick here of them reacting to that. They're returning the Confederate flags. There's a big uptick here in the newspapers about that. The Lee Monument in Washington, D.C., there's, when they were trying to get that, there's a big uptick with the veterans, complaining about that. And the rhetoric of their speeches is remarkably similar. So I don't know if you have any final statements that you want to read from any of the soldiers that are going to just get us right in the heart.
Sure, yeah, I'll give a couple more examples of just ones that I had here but didn't use. These are with no real rhyme or reason, but just ones that I think really kind of stick out to me. I focus so heavily on Pennsylvanians, but here's a few from these might all be here's three New Jersey and one New York. Major Henry Sawyer, 1st New Jersey Cavalry. This is in 1888 at East Cavalry Field. So these are all still Gettysburg related, but this one really always kind of struck me. He's touching on so many themes here. He's touching on reconciliation, on race, on the end of slavery, but also on being on the field where his comrades died. And he's standing at East Cavalry Field and says, "This day recalls the most magnificent triumph of forgiveness the world ever saw. Here in these graves where we laid our comrades, we buried our passions and sectional hate. And here too, we buried the shackles of the slaves." And so there there's so much happening in that veteran's remark. This one comes from a surgeon, J.H.H. Love of the 13th New Jersey. This is 1887. And he's talking about dealing with how to treat Confederate veterans in particular, talking about how he feels as though the Civil War has inspired a more exalted patriotism, a deeper love for our flag. And then he says, "When our misguided brethren, lately in arms against us, say forgive, let us, in accordance with the principles of the religion we profess, say with outstretched hands and cordial greetings, you are forgiven. But let us never forget that treason was treason and loyalty was loyalty." Also from New Jersey, Colonel William Potter. There's this interesting idea that we see so often in veterans where they celebrate the fact that the war had happened because of what was accomplished by it. But, interesting to think about the fact that this massive amount of bloodshed is lauded in some regards. But he says, "Let us cherish firm and clear the ideas of the late war. There is a great gulf fixed as wide as the overarching sky, as deep as the fathomless sea, between treason to the government of the United States and unswerving devotion to the government of the United States. There can be no just comparison between this great government of civil liberty," talking about the United States government, "and the military despotism bored amid the throes of war," talking about the Confederate government, "overthrown by the shock of arms, without history, save 4 years of bloody strife, impelled by the twin furies of slavery and freedom. Let this be the lesson of the hour to ourselves and the generations yet to be." So again, that idea of speaking to generations not yet born. And I guess a final one here, Seth Lowe of the 84th New York, better known as the 14th Brooklyn, says that whatever other issues or constitutional interpretation were involved, they all hinged upon slavery as that which gave to them all their chief meaning and consequence. Talks about how the purpose of the war can change. He makes that a key theme and really touches upon that idea that what we enlisted for may not be the same thing that we feel now. And he says the preservation of the Union was the rallying cry. The preservation of the Union by no possibility could involve only, however, the life of the nation. It involved necessarily the freedom of a race and the best hopes of mankind. Without slavery, the national life would never have been in danger. Without the abolition of slavery, the preservation of the Union was but a dream. And so I think that so many themes. You can read any number of speeches. Those are just a handful of the ones that I think really kind of stick out. But they're fascinating documents. The monuments themselves so often are marvelous pieces of art to look at, and they tell us so much about this generation of millions of people.
I really enjoy. I know you're probably a Troy Harmon fan, as I am. There was one thing I saw on YouTube where he talked about the allegory of the monuments, which is still one of my favorite. I've watched that thing probably 6 times. And that adds a really interesting layer to the artistic side of the monuments and what they stood for, in addition to what they said. they're literal symbols on the monuments as well. Not so much in our Seattle obelisks. You can, I don't know what you can take out of what an obelisk stands for, but when you see 4 or 5 of the same one, it's, there's not much there. But I want to end with 2 quotes. A question. We have a couple questions that popped up here. I'll just hit them real quick. There was a Confederate monument in Washington. It was torn down last year. It was installed in 1926. It had been, in a private cemetery. It was pretty off the radar. I think there had been some vandalism to it, but I think the Union and Confederate veterans actually coexisted here pretty well. There were a lot of Union veterans present at that Confederate memorial dedication, so it went pretty smoothly, relatively speaking. But last year it didn't, and so as part of the overall protests, it was a casualty of that. We no longer have our Confederate monument. And Jesse, you mentioned a couple plaques in Tacoma, one to Viola Kenyon, and she's buried in Seattle at one of the monuments I just showed, the Women's Relief Corps monument. She was the one who founded the Washington State Women's Relief Corps. So she was a big figure in all these monuments in Washington. So it's interesting that she has her own monument, her own plaque. But I'll read 2 here, sort of my final contribution to this from, let's put up his picture here. Addison Hasty. He was a lawyer and a large figure in the Seattle veteran community. Here's Mr. Hasty of the 122nd Illinois. In 1894, I don't know if they were expecting to get monuments. He says, no costly monuments to the Union soldiers or the unknown dead have yet been erected in this new state. In 1889 is when Washington became a state, not a territory, pretty late, so just 5 years after that. The people, however, we are assured, are as patriotic and as liberal as those in other states where such monuments appear, and we are satisfied that they will soon be seen in the cemeteries of the Northwest state as well. The valor of the soldier and the advantages achieved by the Union Army will live longer in the memory of a grateful people than the most enduring granite. So that's kind of interesting to me, right in the middle of this, the sort of monument rush. He's saying, hey, we don't have them yet, but maybe we don't even need them because we're here to keep the memory alive. And then a final one from James Leddy, the 100th Illinois, another prolific speaker, a lawyer. Most of the big orators among the veterans were lawyers here in Seattle. And on Memorial Day, 1892, he wrote of the Union veterans that they made a welcome sacrifice of their lives, not for mercenary motive, conquest, or worldly fame, or at the beck of a monarch's will, but from simple duty and patriotic love for the country and her flag, and that liberty and union might dwell in harmony together. Their illustrious deeds will shine undimmed on history's page, and their immortal names will live in the hearts of the nation while memory lasts and gratitude exists. Remarkable words from our Seattle veterans that could have come from the monument dedication speech of any battlefield or any hometown in New England or Pennsylvania or Michigan. And so I really like the continuity and the unity of the message of what these guys had to say, no matter where they were. They're still our veterans and still had the same thing to say and the same legacy that they left us here or on the Gettysburg battlefield.
Yep, certainly.
So I think that's it for us for tonight. We've gone a little over our hour. Thanks to Codie for sharing everything. Let me put up his page here again. I think I would encourage you guys to follow him. I got hooked on Codie's work from his work on Frederick Douglass, which was awesome. I don't think you've written too much about Frederick lately, have you?
It's been a little while. Yeah, I've kind of gotten away,
while,
but there's some things in the works. So before long there'll be more. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, Codie, thank you, and thank you everybody for watching.
Thanks for having me.
Supporting the page, and go over and give Codie a follow in the Seminary Ridge Museum, Civil War, Pennsylvania. Did I miss anything? I think
Battles
that's
and Banter.
Battles and Banter podcast. That's right. And Avery Lentz
Yep.
from Battles and Banter is going to be a guest on here next month. He's
Right.
going to tell us all about the Overland campaign from beginning to end.
Very good.
We had a lot of veterans that participated in that, so look forward to that. And thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Have a good night.
Thanks.